Welcome back to those who've been attending our COVID-19 series. And today we are talking about labor law and specifically about returning to the workplace and the implications for UAE employers. I am joined by Samantha Ellaby, is a senior associate and employment lawyer at Clyde Co. Hello, Sam.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
All right. So before we get started, I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of introduction of what we will and what we'll not be covering today. Do you just want to give some a few remarks quickly, Sam?
Yeah, please. I think that would be good. So as I'm sure all of you will be aware, this is a rapidly changing area. There are media announcements or new regulations being issued on an extremely regular basis. So I suppose in a typical lawyer fashion, I just want to caveat really what we're going to say today by saying I'm sharing with you today the position as it stands as at 1 o'clock today. But of course, before you take any action or think about what you're doing from a return to work or COVID-19 perspective, you do need to check the latest position. That's not always as easy as it sounds, I suppose, because announcements are issued from a variety of different authorities and are published in a variety of different ways. It can sometimes be difficult to understand what the latest position is. I don't have an easy answer for that necessarily, but we, Clyde Co, do have an article effectively which covers the whole of the GCC that we keep updated whenever there are new developments from a COVID-19 employment perspective. So if any of you aren't already registered and would like to be, then perhaps let Charlotte or myself know, and I'm very happy to register you for that. The other thing I wanted to just mention is that we've obviously only got an hour today, and we've got a lot of content that we'd like to get through, as well as answering some of the questions that you have. So I suppose necessarily some of the comments need to be a little bit generic. But in reality, the answer will very much depend on your company's individual circumstances. So if, for example, you are registered in one of the UAE's free zones, there may, in relation to a particular topic, be specific free zone regulations or guidelines that you need to adhere to. Likewise, I will focus primarily on the onshore position, just because I presume that that's what the majority of you will be interested in. But the DISC and I suppose that the other Emirates and ADGM are entirely different. And I may touch upon that in response to some questions, but it's just important to keep in mind that if you are in the DISC or you're in the ADGM, that there is an entirely separate employment law that will apply there. There we are. There's my caveat.
Great. No, it's really important. Just we have one comment from somebody who can't hear. So if you have issues with the sound before we get started, try muting and unmuting yourself or the sound. If you're still having experiences issues, try to see whether you're having a headset. If not, you can always come out and come back in. It's worked for Samantha. We had a few issues in the first instance. Can I just have a quick chat in the chat? Where are you all joining us from, and can you hear us? You can click on the chat bubble before. Perfect. All right, fantastic. So throughout, everyone's in Dubai. Makes sense. Abu Dhabi. All right. So so thank you for the introduction. We will be running through today. We'll be talking about remote working. The move towards returning to the workplace and what that implies in terms of legal obligations, and a little bit compensation. We look into health and safety measures, and finally, mental well-being and general COVID-19 considerations. If throughout the session you are having any specific questions, please put them in the chat and we'll address them at the time. I may not pick it up straight away because we may be covering it later, but we'll try and answer as many of your questions as possible. All right, so let's start with remote working. And again, we're talking about regulations as of today, and we know that it has been very, very fast moving since March. Are 100% of the employees now permitted to return to the workplace, Sam?
It's a very good question, and actually surprisingly quite a difficult question to start with. So it will rather depend on where the company is registered. Some time ago now, back in March, the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation issued a resolution relating to remote working, which referred to 30% of employees being able to work from the premises and the remainder remote working. That was superseded to an extent in Dubai by the lockdown. So 100% of employees, save in certain sectors, were then remote working. That lockdown has now ended. So in theory, we reverted back to the 30% position, save for some of the exempted sectors that are referred to in the resolution. Since then, in Dubai, the DED announced that 50% of employees were able to return to the workplace. The ministry hasn't amended its resolution, but it has confirmed to us verbally that that is now the figure that it is working to. Subsequently, again in Dubai, the Supreme Committee for Disaster and Crisis Management announced that 100% of employees could return to the workplace. But as I said, the ministry resolution hasn't changed. The ministry at the moment aren't acknowledging that. So when you speak to them, they say 50%, not 100%. So I suppose there is a little bit of ambiguity in terms of what the position actually is. In the free zones, it may be different, so it's worth checking the announcements from your relevant free zone authority. I suppose in terms of getting clarity, we need to wait until there's a formal announcement from the ministry. And in the meantime, my experience is that companies are following a variety of approaches. So some companies have gone back to 100%. Lots that I'm speaking to, the percentages are almost irrelevant, and wherever possible, they are still allowing their employees to work remotely until there's a little bit more safety, I suppose.
So this first question really goes to show, and this is what we've been experiencing since the beginning of the pandemic, there is a lot that's not in writing. There are so many jurisdictions in the one. It's hard for employers and individuals to find one single place where they would find all the information. And so a simple question like this is actually not that simple at all. So to be clear, because I know that's a lot of numbers and a lot of resolutions. So you said 50% of, so we're now back to 30%. 50% can return in the office. There is still the resolution that said it is 30% on paper, but we have been told it's 50%. Now, what about, sorry, I don't know, I'm sure not anyone who missed that. In Dubai, they said now 100% can return in some offices. We've recently seen that cinemas and retail are to reopen 100% capacity. Does this apply to employees as well? And so I guess also, what would be your advice to employers? We're so confused about all of that.
Yeah, I guess if you fall under the jurisdiction of the ministry, the safest approach is to follow what the ministry tell you, what they're telling us at the moment is that it's 50%. Likewise, if you're in a free zone, the safest approach is to follow what your free zone authority is telling you. Because I suppose what we're ultimately talking about here is, let's say you have 100% of your employees back in the workplace and there is then an inspection by the ministry. Will there be any adverse implications? And as long as you're following the advice from your governing jurisdiction, you would expect the answer would be no.
Okay, great. So you've touched upon that. We are seeing employers since the beginning of this pandemic and HR kind of leading the way and trying to follow best practice rather than, especially in cases where it's blurry. So are employers still allowed to continue operating a remote working policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned briefly, that is something that lots of the companies I'm speaking to are still doing. And of course, it very much depends on your industry and how easy it is for your work to be undertaken remotely. But for those in professional services and industries where the work can be done remotely, lots of companies are saying to me really that this is here to stay, and that as and when they do return to the workplace, it will very much be on a phased basis, and that it will be on the basis that employees do work more remotely, they do have more flexible working practices. And I suppose if we want to take a positive out of what has been a very unusual and distressing situation for many, it is that it's rather propelled us into this modern working environment, which for many I think will stay.
Great. Just one last point. I do realise we have a few people from Abu Dhabi. So do they fall under the ministry, or is there what is the situation in Abu Dhabi? We know they're currently under a stricter lockdown than Dubai right now.
Yeah. So it's not a particularly straightforward answer, but the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratization, in theory, has jurisdiction across the Emirates. Apart from in the free zones. So in Abu Dhabi, yes, the ministerial resolutions and the guidelines issued by the ministry would still apply unless you're in a free zone.
Okay, great. So now, what if and we're saying we're seeing employers wanting to continue that remote working policy or flexibility to a large extent. What if employees are not okay with that? Can they not be okay with that and say, well, I never signed up for this? And what could happen in that case?
Sorry, if they're refusing to return to work or refusing
if they're refusing the remote working, because actually we will talk about employees refusing to return to the workplace, but we also see a lot of people who want to get back to the workplace. And employers might be saying, well, actually, for now, like it is the case with the CIPD, the safest place to work from is home, so you're staying home. Could an employee say, no, that's not the best scenario for me, I need to return to the workplace? Would they have any leeway that way?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one. And I suppose, unsurprisingly, it's not something that's dealt with by law, because it's not really something that was an issue pre-COVID-19. I think really, and you'll probably hear me say this for a lot of the questions that are asked today, a common sense approach rather needs to be taken. So why does the employee want to return to work? Is it because of their circumstances at home mean they can't actually work productively at home? Do they have 5 children running around, which means they can't therefore get on with their work, and so I think it's really one where you need to listen to employees' individual concerns, and where possible to try and accommodate those. Of course, if your offices are closed, you don't want to open it just for one employee, and that also needs to be considered, as well as, and we'll come on to this, the various measures that you need to put in place in order to protect employees. And is that in place? Can you do that? But I think really communication is key. If you can't accommodate that employee's request, then communicating with them why, understanding their concerns, seeing if there's any way that you can address those concerns really is a sensible way forward.
Yeah, and I think there's something we've seen across again. So whilst compliance is key, we're here talking about employers, which you have been doing as HR, as the people profession since the beginning of this crisis, but really encourage employers to exert their duty of care, and to try and accommodate their employees' needs. Is a lot of what we're going through, and actually will be going through even after the lockdown hasn't necessarily been covered black and white. A few of the questions that we will be talking about, we have actually covered in our initial webinar with Sam, and I'm going to pop the link to the podcast that we did. Some things have changed, including the lockdown, but a few things around home working, health and safety still very much apply. But quickly, to wrap up this remote working piece, what are the key legal challenges in regards to home working? And quickly, I know we discussed that before. Does an employer's obligation to provide a safe space extend to the home? And has there been any progress law-wise on this topic, or are we still nothing in writing?
So pre-COVID-19, there was, I suppose, an assumption that employees would work from their premises. And if you were to ask me whether it was permitted to work from home pre-COVID-19, I would have said actually the law is a little bit ambiguous on that. It does rather assume that when your work permit permits you to work from your employer's premises. That's all changed, obviously, very dramatically in response to COVID-19. But we still have a position where the law doesn't really address the issue of home working. And so I suppose it follows that there are no express obligations in terms of an employer's obligation where an employee is working from home. So in some jurisdictions, you will have very clear obligations in terms of risk assessments and workstations and what you should do where an employee is working from home. Here you don't, but you do have very broadly worded health and safety obligations in the labour law. So you have a duty to protect the health and safety of your employees. Workplace injuries are defined very broadly, so it includes injuries sustained whilst performing or in connection with the work. So it could, in theory, extend to injuries that are sustained whilst you're working from home. So it is something that employers need to be aware of, particularly as this moves to a longer term arrangement. For some companies, I guess home working was a regular part of everyday life anyway, and so they may well have policies and procedures in place. For those for whom remote working is a new concept, I do think it's worth thinking about your policies and procedures and including within that some guidelines around finding a safe place to work at home and what that means.
That's great. So we're getting that question, but we have seen some employers leading the way. So we've seen, I know that Google and Twitter are doing things like that. So whilst these companies have decided to allow their employees to work remotely indefinitely, they have also decided to offer. So I know Google and Reese, for instance, has given a grant of a certain amount of money for employees to acquire office furniture in their houses. So I know we're getting a few of these questions. This will primarily relate to compensation and reward and your employer value proposition. And so it's again looking at the adaptation, what you can offer that would perhaps be low cost, high value items and allow your employees to perform to the best that they can, while you're probably not able at this point in time to give much incentive. These are things that will go a long way in supporting your employees. All right, so now the move towards returning to the workplace. So yes, flexible working is here to stay, but we're also hearing the government pushing for employees to return to the workplace and perhaps leading the way in a few sectors where they don't really have a choice. Does an employer right now, with the current percentage, have the right to require employees to return to the workplace? Can they make it compulsory?
So I suppose legally speaking, the short answer is yes. An employee, generally speaking, an employee will have a contract of employment that says your place of work is X, which will be the company's premises, and so you as the employer have a contractual right to require the employee to undertake their work from your premises. However, if an employee is refusing, I think it comes back to this kind of law versus practicalities point of view, and the fact that really this very unusual situation isn't understandably addressed in the law. So strictly legally speaking, an employee doesn't have a right to refuse to come into the office. But I think it comes back to why are they refusing? So if they're sick, of course, then that should be sick leave and they're entitled to remain at home and indeed should remain at home and should be paid in accordance with the labour law. If they're refusing because they have a particular medical condition and they're fearful for contracting COVID-19, or they have concerns about the measures that the company has put in place, I do think that's something that needs to be listened to. And again, it ultimately comes down to communication. So listening to employees' concerns and responding to them as much as possible. In terms of other things that can be thought about, I guess understanding what the concern is and what would need to happen in order for the employee to return. If it's a shorter term arrangement, then potentially agreeing with them that they will take a period of annual leave. Can they do their work from home? Can you flex their hours so that they're in the office in quieter working times? Is it due to childcare concerns? In which case, again, can you flex their hours so that they can still meet those childcare needs? So it very much, I think, needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and one that employers are really looking into. As we are looking to return to the workplace, we know that schools are not starting again in time soon, that many of us expats don't necessarily have in-laws, families, or grandparents who would not be able to support with childcare. And so what can employers do to enable people, to enable their employees to efficiently work, but also attend to their duties? So now, if where the concern, so there are concerns that we're talking about here could be more psychologically worried or extra. If the concern of the employee was around health, so let's say a higher risk person, maybe over 60 years old, or having a respiratory condition or an underlying condition, does these groups still need to return to the workplace?
So it is something that's addressed to an extent by the legislation and guidelines that have been coming out off the back of COVID-19. So the ministerial resolution relating to remote working that I mentioned before does say that in terms of remote working, priority should be given to certain groups of employees. So those with respiratory conditions, for example, those who are pregnant, there has also, the Dubai Health Authority issued some guidelines for returning to work earlier this week, which are actually very, very sensible and very interesting. And if you haven't seen them yet, even if you're in Abu Dhabi, I think it's definitely worth having a look at those, because they set out some very sensible suggestions in terms of how you should deal with the return to work. And one of the things that says is that you should do a risk assessment for each of your employees, recognizing their individual circumstances, and of course someone's pre-existing conditions would be something that you would need to take into account in terms of that risk assessment.
So there has been a lot of fake news around this time. Unfortunately, it's been really hard reading out what's being said. I'm seeing somebody just forwarded an article from Gulf News, where they say, for instance, that some groups remain exempt from returning to workplace, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, as well as those with chronic ailments. Does this have any legal backup? Are we again talking about, you're talking here about common sense, about doing a risk assessment, about covering your grounds as an employer. Is this, or are we talking about here that the government mandating that you cannot force people to return?
Yeah, so I haven't seen any official legislation that goes so far as saying those who are pregnant cannot return to work, for example. As I said, the ministerial resolution says that in terms of remote working, priority should be given to those with particular conditions or of particular ages. And again, in the guidelines that came out just this week, it's around being alive to those risk factors and taking appropriate measures which you're able to do within the scope of your business. So, you know, that may be, if your business allows, you enable them to work remotely, but not all businesses will be able to do that. So it's then thinking about, well, what other measures can you put in place to try and protect these more vulnerable or high risk categories as much as possible.
Great. And to close on that note, I know there are questions around that. Sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Charlotte.
I'm really sorry, I was unable to unmute myself. So to close on this, the theme on returning to workplace, do employers have a legal obligation to consider flexible working requests? I'm assuming the answer is no.
Yeah, exactly. So unlike in other jurisdictions, there's no statutory obligation to consider flexible working requests. But I do think it's a good question. I think it is something that employers are going to receive more of following COVID-19. I think sometimes that may be lots of employees I've spoken to have actually quite enjoyed working from home and don't necessarily want to go back to the old ways of spending all day every day in an office. So I think in some cases employees will simply be asking for a little bit more flexibility to be at home a bit more. In other cases, we obviously talked about the fact that schools haven't yet reopened, and so there will undoubtedly be lots of parents with childcare responsibilities that need to be balanced. So I do think it's something that employers should consider. It's also something that has been mentioned in some of the guidelines that have come out. So again, in the Dubai Health Authority Return to Work guidelines, it's one of the measures they talk about, which is thinking about flexible working and staggering your start and finish time so that you don't have huge numbers of employees arriving and departing at the same time, and ultimately so that you can stagger the number of employees in the workplace at any one time to facilitate social distancing, etc. In terms of how you do it, so wherever there is a change to an employee's contractual terms, that would need to be documented in writing, and you obviously need to think about what that means in terms of the employee's package. So sometimes flexible working might just mean you change your start and finish time, but you still do the same hours, in which case I suppose you would expect that the remuneration would remain the same. But it may be that an employee asks to do less hours to fit in with childcare or whatever the case may be, in which case you can discuss and agree a reduction in pay, which may well be to the company's advantage as well. The other point I just wanted to touch on actually is that sometimes employees will say, I want to do the same hours and receive the same pay, but I just want to do them over a 4-day working week, for example. And the thing that employers need to keep in mind is that the labour law says that the maximum working day is 8 hours plus 1 hour for lunch. And where an employee works in excess of that, that's considered overtime. So really it doesn't allow for the condensing of hours in that way.
Okay, great. Into the next section. The last thing I want to touch on, because we are having a few questions on that. Again, they're both end of the spectrum. Those who really want to get back to work, to the workplace, and those who really would like to keep working from home. And then the natural tendency for most employers will be to want to look after their employees and try and protect them as much as possible. What if an employee wants to return to the workplace, but would be a high-risk employee? So, we know that many employers will by now have collected this type of information. What if someone with a respiratory disease or that was considered high risk wanted to return? One, could the employer say no? And two, where the employers would have to agree to them returning, would there be some form of legal protection that you would want to cover yourself, basically, as an employer?
Yeah, I think really it comes down to communication again. So understanding the employee's position and also explaining your position as the company. So if you don't think that your workplace is safe for someone with a respiratory condition, why? You know, what measures are you unable to put in place? Why is that your position, and when is that going to change? You know, is it that you're putting some measures in place and they'll be in place in a couple of weeks, so you just want the employee to stay at home for that time, or is it that actually you're never going to, or until COVID disappears, you're never going to get comfort, which is a different conversation. So I think it ultimately comes down to communication. If the employee is adamant that they want to return to work and you permit that, then I think it is worth putting in place something in writing that says, this is what we've agreed, these are the measures that we're taking, these are the measures that you're going to take.
Great. All right, so we know the final piece is, of course, we still have a lot of employers who have a number of employees abroad. Whether they were stuck or whether they were allowed to go back home. So what if an employee is unable to return to the workplace? Could that be grounds for potentially redundancy if that was required by the company, or are employees protected from that way?
Yeah, so I think the first consideration should be what can you do to try and accommodate this? You know, employees are in a difficult situation. There are a number of employees who left, you know, some on business trips, some for annual leave before the flight restrictions came into effect, and you know, are trying to return, but at the moment can't. So I suppose you need to work through almost a flow chart of options. So can they work remotely? If so, probably the best thing to do is to facilitate that. If they can't work remotely, then I suppose there are a number of things that you could look at which need to be implemented with employee agreement. So it could be they take a period of unpaid leave. It could be that you reduce their pay to reflect the fact that they're unable to work or unable to work fully. You could require them to take annual leave. And then outside of all of that, so can you terminate? There is no distinction from a legal perspective as far as termination is concerned, where someone is in the UAE or outside of it. So in theory, yes, you could still terminate. However, that's subject to the usual rules and restrictions around that. So if it's an unlimited term contract, you need to have a valid reason. And if it's a fixed term contract, you cannot terminate prior to the expiry date without attracting an obligation to pay early termination compensation. And for UAE nationals, there are additional procedures that need to be followed. You mentioned redundancy, and obviously that's a word we're hearing a lot at the moment. But I suppose it's important to keep in mind that that's not actually a concept that's recognised under the UAE labour law. The labour law says that you have to terminate for a valid reason connected to the employee's work, and that's generally interpreted as meaning poor performance or misconduct. Redundancy is a business-related reason. It's not related to the employee's work. And so historically, it has been very difficult to persuade the court that termination by reason of redundancy is valid. Now, that hasn't officially changed in the face of COVID-19. There has been no change to the legislation in that regard. However, there has been a ministerial resolution issued which talks about measures that employers should put in place to try and avoid the need to make redundancies effectively. So it talks about imposing unpaid leave or salary reductions with the employee's agreement. And so I suppose that rather suggests that the expectation of the authorities is that you will look at those measures rather than redundancies. We're still waiting for cases to come out of the court, so we don't have any clarity in terms of how they will interpret it. But I suppose it may be that where an employer can show they've followed those measures and ultimately we're left with no alternative but to still reduce headcount, that may be taken into account by the court. Likewise, if employers make redundancies without first looking at unpaid leave, salary reductions, etc., that may be taken into account and reflected in the decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really strange but important thing to highlight, really, that concept of redundancies. You're saying at this point, as of today, no cases have come out of the court, so there hasn't been one jurisprudence case that has happened, so we could know what to expect in the future.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, no, I haven't seen any cases come out of the court. They're not cases of the court of first instance aren't made publicly available. So it's not like there's a database that you can go to and see when those cases have been published. But certainly the cases that we are dealing with are still going through the system.
Okay, great. All right, and finally, on the concept of redundancies and pay reductions, we have seen a lot of employers as part of the measures taken to avoid making people redundant. There has been a number of working hour reductions and salary reductions. Returning to the workplace, potentially requiring people to, again, go back to their 5-day weeks or whatever they were pre-COVID-19. Does this need to be documented? And is there any obligation for the employer to return to the salary that was pre-COVID?
So it comes down to really what was agreed with the employee at the time. So wherever you're making salary reductions, whether that's temporary or permanent, it should be with an employee's express written agreement. So if, for example, you have agreed to a permanent salary reduction of 10%, for example, then the return to work doesn't impact on that. It may be that employees say, well, now I expect to be paid fully, and that would be a discussion that you'd need to have. On the other hand, it may be that you agreed that whilst you're working remotely, you're going to do a reduced working week, and therefore your pay is going to be reduced accordingly. And then, yes, if you're then adjusting the hours, you would need to adjust the pay to reflect that. So I suppose it comes down to what's been agreed in the first place.
Agreed and documented. I've seen some employers trying to avoid putting that kind of information in writing, not always because of bad reasons, but because they would want to avoid having to redo the paperwork where you have tons of employees say, we agreed that this would be until the 15th of May, but then have to postpone it. So there have been a number of cases where the timeline hasn't been specified or agreed in writing. In this case, what could an employee still have a ground to say, well, no, but we had agreed by email. I haven't signed a contract, but we've agreed via email. Is this binding, or again, is it all about providing formal evidence and contracts in front of the court?
It very much comes down to what you can prove in writing. So that the labour court process is very much a paper-based exercise. You have very limited opportunity to give oral evidence. So it really does come down to the written submissions and supporting documentation that you can provide. Of course, original signatures, so a salary reduction letter that has been signed by the employee provides the most compelling evidence because it's very difficult to challenge that. But emails, anything else, meeting notes, any other written records would also be taken into account by the court. It's just their validity can sometimes be challenged.
Okay, so now we're back to health and safety measures. What COVID-19 related health and safety measures should an employer follow to ensure that the workplace is safe for employees? Yeah.
So it's a good question, and I suppose the first thing I would say is to review the guidelines, if any, that are coming from your governing body. So that may be the Free Zone Authority, that may be the Ministry. As I've mentioned, the Dubai Health Authority has issued guidelines. So you need to consider who your governing body is and what their recommendations or requirements are. In terms of general guidance, so the ministerial resolution relating to remote working sets out a number of measures that employers should follow. So, for example, temperature checking employees on arrival and departure from the office. The Dubai Health Authority guidelines, as I've said, are very, very helpful, and even if they don't strictly apply to you, I think it's worth having a look at them to give you some ideas in terms of measures that you could take. And that says things like providing sanitizers, providing gloves and masks, looking at your seating arrangements to make sure that employees can socially distance, discouraging employees from sharing equipment, and also around educating employees, so providing training, making sure they're aware of the risks and the measures that they should take in order to avoid them. And the other thing I thought was really interesting, and many companies may have done this anyway, but they talk about having a designated point of contact for all COVID-19 related issues, so that firstly, individuals have a known and recognizable person that they can go to if they have any concerns about their own health or that of their colleagues, but also a person that is sufficiently trained to take charge of the situation if there is a confirmed case of COVID-19 in the workplace, for example, because obviously employers need to move very quickly when that happens. You know, it's not a time to start thinking about how you're going to deal with it. If you have an employee that displays symptoms or is confirmed to have it, what are you going to do? Who are you going to contact? How are you going to isolate? You need to have that in place already.
Okay, great. So where can all of these wearing masks, having social distance, are these written, are this in writing by the law? Could an employer get in trouble for not applying, enforcing those rules? And again, is it a case of checking with your free zone, or is that does apply across the Emirates?
Yeah, so it is important to check the rules that apply to you, of course. The ministerial resolution, which I'm sure will apply to lots of attendees on the webinar today, does set out rules, and as I mentioned, such as temperature checking. So they should absolutely be complied with. The Dubai Health Authority are guidelines effectively, but it is still important to comply with them, I suppose, if you think about the broader picture. So if you think about your general health and safety obligations and the fact that you can potentially be liable for workplace injuries, you know, it is important that you, if there is a case, that you can demonstrate that you have taken adequate measures to try and prevent that.
Should an employer not have taken adequate measures to prevent that, could an employee legally refuse to get back to the workplace and report them potentially?
So in terms of reporting, yes. So I suppose if there is, so if it's temperature checking, for example, and that is something that's very clearly set out in the ministerial resolution, and that isn't happening, then yes, I think it's right, and I certainly think the ministry would want to know that that isn't happening, and so yes, absolutely. If it's I guess that you've got to distinguish between what the law says and what kind of guidelines or what's best practice. But certainly, I think that the authorities have an interest in trying to stop the spread of COVID, of course, and so I'm sure they will be interested in hearing of any instances where that potentially isn't happening. So
would that employee have any ground to refuse to get back to the workplace if they knew that social distancing isn't enforced and nobody's wearing masks?
I guess it's not something that's specifically addressed by law, but you would expect the authorities to have sympathy with employees where that is their basis for not returning to the workplace.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about physical well-being and safety. We have seen that the crisis have brought what is now known to be the worst mental health crisis in history. Across the world, we've seen really that being an issue. We just did CIPD report where we found that the majority of employers were more worried about employees' mental health than they were about dealing with the financial impact of the crisis on their business. So that's to say how up in the agenda it has gotten. So remote working and even the potential return to the workplace has potential to impact employee well-being and mental health. What obligations does an employer have in regards to this? Do employers have any obligation legally in the UAE with regards to mental health?
Yeah, it's I think you're absolutely right, Charlotte. It is rightly something that lots of employers are very concerned about. There is legislation that relates to there's obviously legislation that relates to an employer's health and safety obligations. That doesn't really specifically address the issue of mental health, and often the focus is on more physical injuries. But some of it is worded broadly enough that it could well apply to mental well-being. And there is also legislation that does refer to mental health. So there is a law relating to people with determination, which defines disabilities to include mental impairment as well, and talks about obligations to make reasonable adjustments, for example. So yes, it is in a sense addressed by the law, albeit there's not a Mental Health at Work Act, for example, in the same way as there might be in some other jurisdictions.
Yeah. I mean, there again, mental health, I've put down some resources for those of you who are interested in it, but there again, mental health is more part of the duty of care of an employer, and where it is considered that we are expecting employers to look after the people who work for them and do the best that they can to alleviate the pressure. Even though we know and we encourage ourselves as well, I'm imagining most of the people today are HR, you also need to look after your own, but this falls more under the duty of care than under a legal obligation. But obviously we again want to look at the bigger picture, and so think of how this may impact the reputation that you have for years into building or your employer brand in the context that other things may be impacting it already. These may be mental health and well-being, maybe areas where it is an opportunity for employers to differentiate themselves, even at a time of crisis, or especially at a time of crisis. So to wrap this up, I think I wanted to finish with the broader, not written to work specifically, but the broader considerations around COVID-19, things that have been the case pretty much since the beginning of the pandemic. So to start with, what are an employer's reporting obligations where an employee contracts COVID-19?
Yeah, so that's a really important one. COVID-19 was added to the Communicable Diseases Law earlier this year. And what that means essentially is that there are very serious penalties if you fail to report not just confirmed cases of COVID-19, but also suspected cases. So it's something that employers need to be very alive to and need to ensure that they are reporting to the appropriate authorities promptly. And I guess that comes back to making sure that you have those measures in place in the first place. So making sure you are temperature checking, etc., so that you are well placed to report if there are any suspected or confirmed cases.
Again, a fine line with this reporting situation is the balance between privacy and safety. So should an employer inform other employees if one of their colleagues were to contract COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Charlotte. So yes, when I was talking about reporting, I mean reporting to the relevant authorities. You do need to be extremely careful about disclosing those details more widely. You're right, there is a balance to be struck because there will often, I suppose, be a need to notify other employees that they may have come into contact with someone who has COVID-19. But that's as far as you should go. You don't need to say so-and-so has COVID-19. It would be, you know, we have reason to believe that you may have come into contact with someone, and therefore this is what we need you to do.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. If any of you is interested, particularly in the question of privacy and data protection, we did cover this in the podcast, which I popped earlier in. But one of the things that we had talked about was around defamation, and so could potentially the fact that an employer broadcasts an employee having COVID-19 be seen to be a hindrance to the reputation, for instance. And so again, what we've seen is it tends to be a case-by-case basis. It is important to put safety as a priority, but also ensure we don't spread information where it doesn't need to be spread, and be mindful of Protection Data Act. And also, if you are registered outside of the UAE, like we are, there are other data protection regulations that we obey to, such as GDPR, etc. So that's that. I think somebody asked a question, and that's a really good question, although really tactical. Okay, who do we report to where someone has COVID? What are the contact details? Is it the ministry? Is there a hotline?
Yeah, so I don't have the number to hand, although I'm happy to share it afterwards. But there is a designated number that you should call. I think it's actually, so for Dubai-based employers, I think there is a number that's set out in the DHA guidelines. But yes, there are communicated numbers that you should call in the event that someone is confirmed.
Great, and we will also send everyone a post-webinar email, so I'll get this from Sam and we'll send it to you. Are employees still entitled to enhanced sick leave where they are sick due to COVID-19?
So there is no statute. Well, so first of all, onshore, under the labour law, there has been no amendment to the labour law in relation to sick leave as a result of COVID-19. So the statutory position still applies from a legal perspective. However, from a practical perspective, I do think it's worth considering enhancing sick leave, because let's say an employee has already exhausted their fully paid sick leave. So they know that if they contract COVID, they are going to face half pay or potentially no pay. They may, of course, be less likely to come forward to disclose their symptoms. And that, of course, poses a risk to the rest of your workforce. So it is worth thinking about enhancing the position and giving employees some assurances that if they're confirmed to have COVID-19, it won't have any impact on their pay. Interestingly, in the DIFC, a presidential directive was issued which says just that. So if someone has COVID-19, their sick leave must be fully paid, and it effectively falls out of the statutory sick leave regime.
Okay, so that's really interesting again. Well, we know DIFC is usually a bit more, but it kind of sets the tone for what would be expected for employees to do in the UAE. Can an employer compel, and we're just wrapping up in about 2 minutes, can an employer compel an employee to take a COVID-19 test before they return to work, or would that be a breach to privacy?
Compelling them to take the test itself isn't necessarily a breach of privacy. I suppose where the data privacy issues come in is what you do with those results. Lots of contracts will have a contractual right to require employees to attend medical examinations, and if so, you can rely on that right. It is something that a number of employers I know are doing. It's a sensible way, I suppose, of giving other employees comfort that, you know, their colleagues are safe and that they're safe in returning to the workplace.
Great. I think the final question, as we are now hearing that we can start traveling again, but as we return to Dubai, we need to be quarantining ourselves for 14 days. Obviously, a lot of employees will have the question as to, well, I do want to go home and see my family, not necessarily go on holidays in a faraway destination, but we do go see my family. But either I don't have that many days off, or, I have to go and quarantine myself there anyway. I come back. Not many people can afford 5 weeks off. What happens? Where's the position when employees quarantine and employee has to stay home? I guess the assumption of that would be to say, well, we have managed to work from home for so long. It shouldn't be for somebody to keep work in the jobs where it is possible. It shouldn't be an issue for somebody to work from home if they were quarantined. But could this be grounds again for some disciplinary measures?
Yeah, so it's again, I think it's probably case by case basis. The law doesn't deal with quarantine itself, and I suppose it depends on the reason for the quarantine. So if it is a precaution, they've returned from outside of the UAE and they're having to quarantine, but medically they're fine, then it's not something that's dealt with by law. But I think you run through that list of, okay, can they work remotely? If so, great, fully paid. If not, have they got annual leave that you can require them or you can require them to take? If not, can you agree a period of unpaid leave with them? In terms of whether or not it's ground for disciplinary action, as an employer, you don't have a legal right to prevent your employees from travelling abroad. But I think what is sensible and what lots of companies have done is issue travel guidelines, whereby they say, as it stands, if you exit the UAE, there is no guarantee that you will be able to get back in when you want to, and that may have an impact on your employment. And I think in the face of clear company guidelines, if an employee then chooses to travel and is unable to return or has to be quarantined and can't work remotely, it makes it easier to take some sort of action on that basis.
Again, a very difficult decision for many HR teams in the UAE, as it is never a decision that one wants to take, but when there will be a time if there is a time to look at redundancies, unfortunately, we've spoken to employers in the region and we'll be looking at the ones who are still stuck away at the moment rather than the people who are in the country. So, all right. So, is almost time's up. Participants, do you have any, how was this helpful? Do you have any question that you would like us to address?
Yeah, and I've seen there's been a few questions coming through. Hopefully we've addressed most of them as we've gone through, but if not, then I'm very happy for people to get in touch. I
picked up most of those in our conversation. There's one which I didn't, but I'm not sure to the question. Let me send it over to you. Everyone else, was it helpful, not helpful? Is there anything you wish we had said, which we haven't? Let us know in the chat before we wrap up the session.
It's gone very quickly. I feel like we could have talked for another hour or two. There's so much to say. This
literally really works super quickly, and also because there are so many questions that everybody has that are very specific to industries. Yeah, it does go fast.
Yeah.
I sent you a question, Sam, from Zinni. I'm not sure I understood the question. If you want to look.
Is this around the resignation during the resolution? It's quite a long question, so I won't make everyone watch me whilst I read through it, but I'll have a look at it after the session, and I'm happy to follow up with an answer.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will be having more of these webinars around COVID-19, and we have also a few leadership webinars in partnership with some leadership gurus. we work with Clyde Co, and we will be offering, we offer today labor law courses that we are now able to offer virtually soon enough, starting September. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know. And if you want to be in contact with Clyde Co, I am happy to introduce you, so you have all our emails. If you need more information, I've popped in a few links in the comments. You can always go to cipd.ae/news, where you will find the Q&A that we've done with Clyde Co, or cipd.ae/knowledge/coronavirus, where we have put together a whole workforce planner and questions around returning to work. So hopefully that is helpful. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much, Sam. It was great.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.